1986, Connecticut, Snedeker family, the funeral home that the Warrens documented and Hollywood wanted to forget. In the summer of 1986, the Snedeker family faced a crisis that no parent should ever have to endure. Their eldest son, Philip, had been diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, an aggressive cancer that attacks the body's lymphatic system and primarily affects children and young adults. Treatment required frequent chemotherapy and radiation sessions at the University of Connecticut Hospital, located on the outskirts of Southington. The problem was the distance. The family lived hours away from the hospital. Each trip was torture for Philip, especially the return trips home after brutal oncology treatment sessions. His weakened body could barely tolerate the movement of the car. The pain, the nausea, the extreme fatigue that cancer and chemotherapy caused in his adolescent body. Alan Snedeker and his wife Carmen knew they couldn't continue like this. Alan was a former stonemason who, according to subsequent reports, struggled with alcoholism issues. Carmen worked as a waitress but at that time was between jobs. Money was scarce, extremely scarce. But Philip needed to be close to the hospital. His life depended on it. The Snedeker family consisted of Alan and Carmen, their 4 biological children, and Carmen's niece, a young woman named Tammy who lived with them. The 4 children were Philip, the eldest and sickest, Bradley, Alan Jr., and Jennifer, the only girl. A large family that needed space. A family in crisis that needed stability. A desperate family that needed an economic miracle. That miracle seemed to arrive when they found a rental listing in the local newspapers. A 5-bedroom, 2-bathroom house at number 208 Meriden Avenue, Southington, Connecticut. The price was surprisingly low for a property of that size. Too low in retrospect. But for a family on the verge of financial collapse, it seemed like the answer to their prayers. The house was located in a quiet Southington neighborhood, a small Connecticut town with that typical New England charm that appears on postcards. Tree-lined streets, colonial-style houses, established community, and most importantly, it was close to the hospital where Philip received treatment. On June 30, 1986, the Snedekers signed the lease contract and moved into their new home. The house had been built in 1916. In 1936, the property was converted into the Hallahan Funeral Home, a family business that operated for decades serving the residents of Southington and surrounding areas. For over 40 years, that house had been the place where the community's dead were prepared for their final farewell. The place where bodies were embalmed, where families held wakes for their deceased, where death was a daily business. When the funeral home closed its operations in the 1980s, the property was sold and hastily converted into a rental dwelling. The wake rooms became bedrooms. The chapel was transformed into a living room. But the basement remained essentially intact. According to Carmen Snedeker's testimony documented in multiple subsequent interviews, including the 2002 documentary, A Haunting in Connecticut, and statements recorded in the Hartford Courant in 1992, the family had no idea of the house's history when they signed the lease contract. The move proceeded with initial normalcy. The children chose their rooms with the usual sibling disputes. Furniture was placed. Boxes were unpacked. Everything seemed like a promising new beginning for a family that desperately needed it. But then Carmen went down to the basement. According to her documented testimony, the basement had been blocked by construction materials during the initial house visit. Renovators had left equipment and supplies that prevented complete access to the area. It wasn't until after the move, when they began to fully explore the property, that Carmen descended the stairs into the house's underground. What she found left her paralyzed. Hidden under dusty sheets, concealed in old boxes, and stacked against the basement's stone walls were the instruments. Embalming equipment. Mortuary preparation tables. Specialized surgical tools designed to drain blood and fill bodies with formaldehyde. The entire macabre arsenal necessary to convert a corpse into a presentable body for a funeral. In an interview with the website Chasing the Frog, Carmen stated, "There were a couple of photos in the home, but there were many toe tags and a head tag. There were other personal items of the deceased." The Snedekers contacted the house's owner, a man named Darrell Kern, to confirm their suspicions. According to the Hartford Courant article from 1992, Kern confirmed that the property had indeed been the Hallahan Funeral Home for decades. However, Kern claimed he had informed the family about this fact before they signed the lease contract. Carmen, for her part, maintained until the end that they were never told the truth about the house until after they moved in. This discrepancy about who knew what and when would become one of the many points of controversy that would surround the case in subsequent years. Despite the disturbing discovery, the family decided to stay. They had no real alternative. They had signed a contract. They had spent their scarce resources on the move. And most importantly, they were close to the hospital where Philip was fighting for his life. The two eldest sons, Philip and Bradley, claimed the basement as their bedroom. As teenagers, they wanted privacy away from their younger siblings. The basement was spacious compared to the smaller rooms on the upper floors. According to documented records, the boys set up their beds in what had been the casket display room, located down the hallway that connected to the former embalming room. Philip, weakened by cancer and chemotherapy, would spend most of his days in that basement, resting, recovering between treatments, sleeping in a room that for decades had been the last place thousands of bodies occupied before being buried. The house at number 208 Meriden Avenue had history, had memory, and according to what the Snedeker family would report in the following months, that memory was far from being at peace. Southington is a small town where everyone knows everyone's secrets. The older neighbors knew perfectly well what that house had been. Some crossed the street to avoid passing too close. Others simply didn't talk about it. But everyone knew it. The house where the dead were prepared. In the initial weeks, life proceeded with some normalcy within what was possible. Philip continued his treatments. The children adapted to the new neighborhood. Carmen tried to establish routines. Alan worked to keep the family financially afloat. But something began to change. Small things at first. Objects that weren't where they should be. Inexplicable sounds at night. Sudden temperature changes in specific rooms. Sensations of being watched when no one else was present. Carmen, in her testimony documented for the book, In a Dark Place, the story of a true haunting from 1992, written by Ray Garton along with investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren, stated that the phenomena began practically from the first night in the house. The children reported seeing strange people in the house. Figures that appeared and disappeared. Voices that whispered in empty rooms. Footsteps in the basement when everyone was upstairs. Philip, in particular, began to behave strangely. He would play cruel jokes on his family that he later didn't remember doing. His personality seemed to fluctuate in ways that the stress of cancer treatment didn't completely explain. The Snedeker family didn't know they were living in what would become one of the most documented and controversial paranormal cases in American history. They didn't know that in 1988, desperate and terrified, they would contact Ed and Lorraine Warren, the most famous paranormal investigators in the United States, known for their work on the Amityville case. They didn't know that the Warrens would spend weeks in that house with an investigation team, documenting phenomena that would defy any rational explanation. They didn't know that their story would be turned into a published book, a television documentary, and eventually a Hollywood film in 2009 titled The Haunting in Connecticut. And they didn't know that to this day, more than 3 decades later, the Snedeker case would continue to be intensely debated between believers and skeptics, between those who claim everything was real and those who maintain everything was invented. The only indisputable fact is what is documented in public records. A family with a seriously ill son moved into a former funeral home in Southington, Connecticut on June 30, 1986. And what they reported experiencing in that house would change their lives forever. The house still exists at number 208 Meriden Avenue. New owners have lived there since then. Some report experiencing nothing unusual. Others tell different stories. But in the summer of 1986, when the Snedeker family crossed the threshold of that house for the first time, carrying their hopes and fears, they couldn't imagine what awaited them. The basement held more than forgotten mortuary equipment. And Philip, the sick boy who would sleep in the former casket display room, would soon discover that some rooms never forget what they were built for. The nightmare was about to begin. To fully understand what the Snedeker family reported experiencing in the house on Meriden Avenue, it's necessary to understand who they were before moving there. A common American family facing an extraordinary medical crisis, struggling with economic problems, but fundamentally normal in all respects. Alan Snedeker had worked as a stonemason for years. It was a hard trade, physically demanding, requiring strength and endurance. According to multiple documented sources, including testimonies collected by paranormal investigators and subsequent interviews, Alan struggled with alcoholism, a personal battle that added additional tension to a family already under extreme pressure. He wasn't a violent man according to records, but alcohol complicated a family situation that was already difficult for obvious reasons. Carmen Snedeker worked as a waitress, a common job for mothers who needed flexible schedules to care for their children. In the summer of 1986, she was between jobs, which meant the family depended almost completely on Alan's irregular income. Money was a constant problem. Medical bills for Philip's treatment were accumulating. Health insurance covered part but not all. Never all. The children represented the full spectrum of childhood and adolescence. Philip was the eldest, a teenager who before the cancer diagnosis had shown interest in art and creativity. Hodgkin's lymphoma had brutally interrupted his normal life. Chemotherapy had weakened him physically, but according to all documented testimonies, his mind remained sharp and his personality intact in those first months of treatment. Bradley was the second son, old enough to understand the gravity of his brother's illness, but still a child processing the fear and uncertainty of watching his older brother fight cancer. He and Philip were close, shared interests, and would now share that basement that had been a funeral home. Alan Jr. and Jennifer were the youngest, children who needed attention and care amid the family chaos centered on Philip's illness. And then there was Tammy, Carmen's niece, a teenager who lived with the family for reasons that public records don't clearly specify, but who was considered an integral part of the family nucleus. This was the family that moved to number 208 Meriden Avenue on June 30, 1986. The first days in any new house are always a mix of chaos and excitement. Boxes to unpack, furniture to place, routines to establish. For the Snedekers, there was the addition of relief at finally being close to the hospital where Philip received treatment. The exhausting trips had ended. Now, when Philip needed to go to the University of Connecticut hospital, they would be only minutes away instead of hours. The house was undoubtedly spacious for the price they paid. 5 bedrooms meant the children wouldn't have to share rooms as tightly as in their previous home. 2 full bathrooms made chaotic family mornings easier. And the Southington neighborhood was quiet, safe, exactly the type of environment any parent would want for their children. According to Carmen's testimony documented in multiple sources, including the documentary A Haunting in Connecticut and the book In a Dark Place, the initial move went surprisingly well. The children chose their rooms. Philip and Bradley, as the eldest, claimed the basement as their private space. It was a logical decision. Teenagers wanting distance from their younger siblings, seeking privacy, enjoying the larger space that the basement offered compared to the standard rooms on the upper floors. The basement was effectively large. It occupied the entire ground floor of the house and had been divided into several rooms during its time as a funeral home. One of those rooms had been the casket display room, a space where grieving families chose the appropriate coffin for their loved ones. Another room, further back and with access to special drains installed in the cement floor, had been the embalming room proper. When renovators converted the funeral home into a rental dwelling, they had installed wooden panels on some basement walls to give it a more residential appearance. They had added a full bathroom. They had tried, superficially, to erase the traces of what that space had been for 40 years. But beneath the new panels, the old walls remained. And in some areas, mortuary equipment had simply been hidden behind construction materials instead of being completely removed. Carmen has consistently stated in all her documented interviews that the basement had been blocked by renovation materials during their initial house visit. This is the reason, according to her version, why they didn't discover the property's true nature until after moving in. The owner, Darrell Kern, contradicted this version in the Hartford Courant article from 1992, claiming he had clearly informed the family about the house's history. This discrepancy was never definitively resolved. What is documented without dispute is what Carmen found when she finally gained complete access to the basement after the move. The embalming equipment wasn't simply 1 or 2 forgotten pieces. According to Carmen's descriptions documented in the book, In a Dark Place, and in the interview with the website Chasing the Frog, there were mortuary preparation tables, pulleys and chains designed to move bodies, specialized surgical tools, tubes for bodily fluid drainage. The entire technical arsenal necessary for the embalming process. Alien, sinister tools. Frightening, unspeakable tools. Steel devices darkened with age, is how Carmen described the instruments she found, according to the book, In a Dark Place. A platform connected to chains that were attached to a large hoist. Equipment designed specifically to manipulate lifeless human bodies. In addition to the physical equipment, Carmen reported finding photographs. Not many, but enough to be disturbing. Images of deceased persons in different stages of preparation for their funerals. And more disturbing still, tags. The identification tags that are placed on the toes of corpses in morgues and funeral homes. There were many of those tags according to Carmen. Some for toes, one for a head. Personal items of deceased people who had passed through that house on their way to the grave. The boys, Philip and Bradley, saw the equipment. They knew their new bedroom had been part of a funeral home. But according to records, this information didn't dissuade them from staying in the basement. They were teenagers. The idea of sleeping in a former funeral home probably had an element of morbid excitement for them. And more pragmatically, the basement offered the space and privacy they wanted. Philip set up his bed in what had been the casket display room. The walls of that room had seen thousands of open coffins. Thousands of bodies prepared and presented for grieving relatives. Decades of death concentrated in that specific space. And Philip, with his body weakened by cancer and the toxic chemicals designed to kill him before cancer could, would sleep there every night. Rest there between his hospital treatment sessions. Spend hours in that room, alone in the darkness, while his body tried to recover from the necessary medical assaults to save his life. According to Carmen's testimony documented in A Dark Place, the strange phenomena began almost immediately. The first night in the house, according to her account, there were already signs that something wasn't right. Objects that disappeared and reappeared in different places. Carmen reported that she began to notice that common household objects, things she had placed in specific locations, simply weren't there when she returned to look for them. They would appear hours or days later in completely illogical locations. The dishes, according to Carmen, seemed to put themselves away. She reported multiple instances of leaving dirty dishes in the sink or on the counter, only to find them washed and stored in the cabinets without anyone in the family admitting to having done it. The lights began to behave strangely. They would turn on and off without anyone touching the switches. This continued even when Carmen completely removed the bulbs from the lamps, according to her documented testimony. Flickering lights without apparent electrical source. The temperature in certain rooms fluctuated without explanation. Rooms that should be warm in the Connecticut summer would suddenly become cold. It wasn't the normal cold of air conditioning or a draft. Carmen described it as an unnatural, penetrating cold that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The children began to report their own experiences. They saw figures. People who shouldn't be there. Shadows that moved in the periphery of their vision. Human shapes that appeared briefly and then disappeared when they tried to focus on them directly. They heard sounds. Voices whispering in rooms they knew were empty. Footsteps in the basement when the entire family was gathered on the upper floor. The sound of doors opening and closing when there were no drafts or anyone near the doors. But the most disturbing thing, according to documented testimonies, was what began to happen to Philip. The boy who had been creative and good-natured before cancer, the teenager who was bravely fighting a terrible disease, began to change in ways that went beyond the known effects of chemotherapy. Carmen reported that Philip began to play cruel jokes on his siblings. Jokes that were completely out of character for him. Mean and sometimes frightening actions that seemed designed to scare or emotionally hurt the younger family members. And most disturbing, when confronted about these actions, Philip seemed genuinely confused. He didn't remember doing them. He couldn't explain why he had done it, if indeed he had done it. His personality began to fluctuate. Moments of normalcy interrupted by episodes where he seemed to be a completely different person. Darker. More aggressive. With knowledge or behaviors that didn't fit with the Philip his family knew. Philip's treating physicians, according to available records, attributed these changes to the extreme stress of cancer treatment. Chemotherapy can cause neurological effects. Cancer itself, depending on its progression, can affect behavior. And certainly, a teenager facing his own mortality would experience significant psychological changes. But Carmen felt there was something more. Something the doctors couldn't see or didn't want to acknowledge. Something related to that house. To that basement. To the rooms where thousands of bodies had been drained of life and prepared for death. The Snedekers tried to maintain normalcy. Philip continued his treatments. The children went to school when the school year began. Alan worked when he could. Carmen tried to keep the house running, prepare meals, care for a large family amid the chaos of a terminal illness. But beneath that appearance of normalcy, something was changing. The house, according to the family's testimonies, wasn't simply a structure of wood and stone. It was something more. Something that remembered what it had been. Something that hadn't forgotten the decades of death it had harbored. And in the basement, where Philip slept in the former casket display room, where the deadly tools still remained hidden behind new panels, where the medicinal smell of formaldehyde seemed to permeate the cement walls even years after the funeral home closed its operations, something was awakening. Or perhaps it had never slept. The first weeks would become months, and what began as strange but tolerable phenomena would escalate towards something the family would describe as absolutely terrifying. Something that would eventually lead them to seek help beyond conventional medicine. Beyond science. Beyond reason. But in those early days of July 1986, as the Snedeker family tried to adapt to their new home, they still had hope. Hope that Philip would recover. Hope that proximity to the hospital would make a difference. Hope that this house, despite its macabre past, could be the place where their family would finally find some peace. That hope wouldn't last long. The strange phenomena that the Snedeker family reported in the first weeks soon evolved into something much more intense and terrifying. What began as displaced objects and flickering lights gradually transformed into experiences the family would describe as absolutely terrifying and that paranormal investigators would eventually document professionally. According to Carmen Snedeker's testimony recorded in multiple documented sources, one of the most disturbing incidents occurred while she was cleaning the basement floor. Carmen was mopping the cement floor of the former embalming room when she noticed that the water in her bucket began to change color. It wasn't normal dirt from the floor. The water was turning red. A red that Carmen described as blood. In her documented interview, Carmen stated, "The mop water turned blood red. It wasn't a slight or ambiguous discoloration. According to her testimony, the water in the bucket transformed into a reddish liquid that looked disturbingly like diluted blood." Carmen emptied the bucket, filled it with clean water again and continued cleaning. The phenomenon repeated. The water turned red again. This incident occurred in the exact area where, for decades, the Hallahan Funeral Home had drained blood and bodily fluids from corpses during the embalming process. The special drains installed in that cement floor had been designed specifically for that macabre purpose. Thousands of liters of human blood had flowed through that floor. And now, years after the funeral home closed, Carmen reported that the cleaning water was turning red without apparent explanation. The dishes continued to move on their own. Carmen insisted on this phenomenon in all her documented interviews. She would leave dirty dishes in the sink before going to bed. In the morning, the dishes would be washed and stored in the cabinets. No family member admitted to having done it. Everyone denied any knowledge of how the dishes had been cleaned and put away. The lights throughout the house behaved increasingly erratically. It wasn't simply a standard electrical problem. Carmen reported that even after completely removing the bulbs from the lamps, the lights continued to flicker. Rooms completely in darkness, with no electrical source connected, would briefly illuminate with inexplicable flashes of light. But it was the children's experiences that began to truly alarm Carmen and Alan. Bradley Snedeker, the second oldest son, experienced one of the most documented incidents of the case. According to multiple sources, including the documentary A Haunting in Connecticut and testimonies collected by the Warren investigators, Bradley was physically attacked by invisible forces in the basement. The incident involved a hospital gurney, one of the many pieces of medical equipment that had remained from the funeral home era. Bradley was in the basement, possibly playing or exploring, when the gurney began to move on its own. According to documented testimony, Bradley was spun uncontrollably on the gurney. His body rotated without him being able to stop it, without any visible physical force causing the movement. The boy screamed for help. Other family members heard the screams and ran to the basement to find Bradley terrified, still on the gurney after the phenomenon finally stopped. This incident was traumatic enough that the family reported it consistently in all subsequent interviews. It wasn't a story that changed over time. The details remained constant. Bradley on the gurney, spinning out of control, terrified, with no possible physical explanation. The visual apparitions became more frequent and more defined. Carmen, in her most detailed documented testimonies, described seeing at least two distinct entities in the house. The first was an extremely thin figure with high cheekbones, long black hair, and eyes that Carmen described as pitch black or like pitch. This figure appeared mainly in the basement and in areas near where the embalming room had been. It was an intimidating presence, according to Carmen, that emanated malevolence. The second apparition was equally disturbing but different in appearance. Carmen described it as a figure with white hair and white eyes, dressed in a pinstriped suit, with feet in constant movement. This second entity seemed to manifest in different areas of the house, not limited to the basement like the first figure. These descriptions were documented in the book, In a Dark Place, and in multiple subsequent interviews. Carmen was consistent in her physical descriptions of these apparitions. They weren't vague shadows or ambiguous shapes. According to her testimony, they were fully formed figures, visible with enough detail to describe specific facial features and clothing. The other children also reported seeing strange people in the house. Figures they didn't recognize. Individuals who appeared in hallways or rooms and who disappeared when they tried to approach or when they called their parents. The younger children, Alan Jr. and Jennifer, were afraid to be alone in certain areas of the house. particularly near the basement. Smells began to manifest. Carmen reported on multiple occasions that the house sometimes smelled intensely of rotting or decomposing flesh. It wasn't a problem with trash or spoiled food. The smell appeared suddenly in specific rooms, mainly in the basement and in areas connected with the former funeral operation. It was a nauseating, penetrating smell that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves and that disappeared as mysteriously as it appeared. On other occasions, Carmen reported smelling formaldehyde, the chemical used in embalming. This smell was particularly strong in the basement, decades after the funeral home had closed its operations. Chemically, formaldehyde can persist in porous materials like wood and cement for prolonged periods, but the intensity of the smell Carmen described suggested something beyond normal chemical residue. Philip, meanwhile, continued to deteriorate in ways that went beyond what cancer treatment explained. His personality continued to fluctuate dramatically. Moments where he was the sensitive and creative boy his family knew, interrupted by episodes where he became aggressive, cruel, almost unrecognizable. The jokes that Philip played on his siblings became more disturbing. According to documented testimonies, these actions weren't simply adolescent pranks. They were behaviors designed to terrorize. And Philip, when confronted about these incidents, genuinely didn't remember committing them. His confusion seemed real. His inability to remember his own actions was consistent and concerning. Carmen began to notice that Philip spent long periods in the basement, alone, in states she couldn't fully describe. Sometimes she would find him simply sitting in the darkness, staring fixedly at the walls. When she asked him what he was doing, Philip seemed disoriented, as if waking from a trance. Medical treatments continued. Philip traveled regularly to the University of Connecticut hospital for his chemotherapy and radiation sessions. Doctors monitored his progress against Hodgkin's lymphoma. Physically, the treatment seemed to be working in some respects, but psychologically, something was fundamentally wrong with the boy. The family consulted with Philip's doctors about the behavioral changes. The oncologists, according to available records, suggested that the psychological stress of cancer treatment could manifest in personality changes. They recommended psychological evaluation. They considered the possibility that Philip was experiencing neurological effects from chemotherapy, which is a known although relatively rare side effect of certain cancer treatment protocols. But the medical explanations didn't satisfy Carmen. She was convinced there was a connection between the changes in Philip and the house itself, between her son's deterioration and that basement where he slept every night, surrounded by the tools of death, in a room that had seen thousands of bodies prepared for burial. It was during this period that Carmen decided to investigate more deeply into the house's history. She already knew it had been the Hallahan Funeral Home, but she wanted to understand more. She wanted to know exactly what had occurred in that house during its decades of operation as a funeral home. Carmen's research, using public records from the city of Southington and conversations with older neighbors in the area, confirmed that the Hallahan Funeral Home had operated at number 208 Meriden Avenue for over 40 years. The house had been built in 1916 and converted into a funeral home in 1936 by the Hallahan family. For decades, the Hallahan Funeral Home had been a respected business in Southington. Local families brought their deceased there to be prepared and waked. It was, according to the older neighbors Carmen consulted, a professional and dignified operation. The Hallahans were remembered as respectable people who performed a necessary service for the community. But Carmen also began to hear rumors. Whispered stories about the house. Some neighbors admitted they avoided passing near the property after nightfall, even years after the funeral home closed. There was a general feeling of discomfort associated with that place among the older residents of Southington. Carmen shared her findings and concerns with Alan. The couple discussed the possibility of moving again, of finding another house closer to the hospital. But economic realities made it nearly impossible. They had already spent their scarce resources on the move to Southington. The lease contract was signed, and finding another affordable property of sufficient size for their large family near the hospital would be extremely difficult, if not impossible. In a subsequent interview that would become notorious, Carmen was asked about why she didn't simply take her children out of the house given the terrifying phenomena she was reporting. Her response, documented on video, was bizarre and concerning. "Children need stability, hopefully it won't kill them." This statement would be repeatedly cited by skeptics of the case as evidence that something didn't add up in the Snedeker narrative. What mother would keep her children in a house she believed was actively killing them? Carmen's response suggested either a strange disconnect from reality, or that the situation was more complex than she could express in a brief interview. The phenomena continued to escalate as the weeks and months of 1986 passed and they entered 1987. What had begun as strange inconveniences had transformed into genuinely terrifying experiences. The family lived in a constant state of tension and fear. Tammy, Carmen's niece who lived with the family, also began to report her own experiences. According to subsequent documented testimonies, Tammy felt presences in the house. She experienced the sensation of being touched by invisible hands. In a particularly disturbing testimony, Tammy reported feeling that unseen entities were grabbing her or touching her in inappropriate ways, experiences that terrified her deeply. Objects in the house continued to move without explanation. They weren't just dishes. They were keys that disappeared and reappeared. Clothing found in rooms where no one had left it. Doors that slammed shut forcefully without wind or people nearby. Drawers that opened on their own during the night, the sound waking family members. The basement had become the epicenter of the reported paranormal activity. It was there where the phenomena were most intense and frequent. And it was there where Philip spent most of his time when he wasn't at the hospital receiving treatment. Carmen began to document the incidents. Not in a formal or systematic way, but she began to keep a sort of mental record of what was occurring. The dates, the times, the types of phenomena, who had witnessed them. She knew, on some level, that she would need this information eventually, that she would need to be able to prove that what they were experiencing was real. Neighbors began to notice that something was wrong at the Snedeker house. Not necessarily because the family shared their experiences widely, but because the family's behavior had changed. The children seemed more withdrawn. Carmen and Alan seemed perpetually stressed beyond what Philip's illness explained. The house itself seemed to have a different atmosphere, according to what some neighbors would admit years later. But the Southington community, like many small communities, didn't talk openly about such things. Haunted houses weren't a topic of polite conversation. And the Snedekers, aware of the potential stigma, didn't share their experiences widely with neighbors or acquaintances. The situation reached a critical point at the end of 1987. Philip had completed his initial cancer treatment protocol. Doctors were monitoring his progress, but Hodgkin's lymphoma seemed to be responding to treatment, which was incredibly positive news. Philip had a real chance of surviving this terrible disease. But his mental state continued to deteriorate. The personality changes had become more pronounced. The periods of amnesia or confusion were more frequent. And the phenomena in the house had reached a level of intensity that the family felt they couldn't continue to endure. It was then that Carmen made a decision that would change the course of this entire story. She had heard about Ed and Lorraine Warren, the most famous paranormal investigators in the United States. The Warrens had worked on the Amityville case, one of the most publicized haunted house cases in history. They were known, respected in paranormal circles, and had decades of experience investigating reported supernatural phenomena. Carmen decided to contact them. In 1988, approximately 2 years after the Snedeker family moved to number 208 Meriden Avenue, Carmen called Ed and Lorraine Warren and explained what her family was experiencing. She told them about the basement that had been an embalming room, about the apparitions, about the objects that moved on their own, about the water that turned red, about the terrifying changes in her cancer-stricken son's personality. The Warrens, according to documented records from their organization, the New England Society for Psychic Research, agreed to investigate the case. They would arrive in Southington with a complete team, with cameras, with recording equipment, with other paranormal investigators including their nephew John Zaffis. And what they would document in that house, according to their official archives now publicly accessible, would confirm the most terrifying claims of the Snedeker family and add new dimensions to the case that no one had anticipated. The professional investigation of the Snedeker case was about to begin. And with it, the family story on Meriden Avenue would become one of the most controversial and documented paranormal cases in modern American history. The terror in the Southington basement would finally have witnesses beyond the family that had endured it in silence for nearly 2 years. In 1988, approximately 2 years after the Snedeker family moved into the house on Meriden Avenue, Ed and Lorraine Warren arrived in Southington, Connecticut, with their paranormal investigation team. The Warrens weren't ordinary investigators. They were, at that time, the most recognized names in the field of paranormal investigation in the United States. Edward Warren Miney had been born on September 7, 1926. He described himself as a demonologist, although he had no formal academic credentials in theology or related fields. He was self-taught, an investigator who had spent decades studying cases of alleged demonic possessions and haunted houses. He was also an artist and author, having written multiple books about his investigations. Lorraine Rita Warren, born Lorraine Moran on January 31, 1927, described herself as clairvoyant and a light trance medium. She claimed to have psychic abilities that allowed her to perceive spiritual entities and paranormal energies that others couldn't detect. She worked closely with her husband on all investigations. In 1952, the Warrens had founded the New England Society for Psychic Research, the oldest ghost hunting organization in New England. They claimed to have investigated over 10,000 cases during their career. The most famous had been the Amityville case, the alleged haunted house in Long Island that had captured public imagination in the 70s and had generated multiple books and films. The Warrens arrived at the Snedeker house accompanied by several members of their investigation team. Among them was John Zaffis, Ed and Lorraine's nephew, who would eventually become a recognized paranormal investigator in his own right and a collector of allegedly haunted objects. According to documented records of the Warren investigation, which were subsequently included in the book, In a Dark Place, the story of a true haunting published in 1992, the team spent several weeks at the house on Meriden Avenue. It wasn't a brief one-night investigation. It was an exhaustive investigation that included multiple overnight sessions, extensive interviews with each family member, and the use of various recording and detection equipment. The Warrens brought photographic cameras, audio recorders, thermometers to detect temperature changes, and other instruments they used in their paranormal investigations. Their methodology, according to their own archives, included both scientific observation and psychic evaluation by Lorraine. Carmen Snedeker provided the Warrens with a detailed account of everything the family had experienced during the previous 2 years. The apparitions, the moving objects, the water that turned red, the inexplicable smells, the changes in Philip. Everything was documented by the Warren team. The investigators proceeded to conduct their own exploration of the house. They examined every room with particular focus on the basement where Philip and Bradley slept and where most of the paranormal activity had been reported. It was during this initial exploration that the Warrens made a discovery that would add a particularly disturbing dimension to the case. According to records of their investigation, the Warrens found evidence that not all the mortuary equipment had simply been left in the basement. Some instruments were literally incorporated into the house's walls. Behind the wooden panels that had been installed during the renovation of the funeral home into a dwelling, the investigators reported finding embalming tools and other deadly instruments embedded in the wall structures. These objects weren't simply stored or abandoned. They were physically integrated into the house's construction, hidden but permanent. The Warrens also conducted historical research on the property. Using public records from Southington and interviews with older residents of the area, they confirmed that the Hallahan Funeral Home had operated at that location from 1936 until the early 80s. They confirmed that the basement had functioned as an embalming room. They confirmed that thousands of bodies had been processed in that space over 40 years. But the Warrens also claimed to have discovered something darker in the house's history. Something that hadn't been public knowledge but that, according to them, explained the intensity of the paranormal activity the Snedeker family was experiencing. According to the Warren investigation documented in a Dark Place, and in multiple subsequent interviews, one of the workers at the Hallahan Funeral Home had allegedly been found guilty of necrophilia. That is, of committing sexual acts with the corpses that passed through the funeral home. This claim is extremely controversial and has never been independently verified. Skeptical investigators who subsequently examined the Snedeker case, including writer Ray Garton who wrote In a Dark Place, couldn't find any court or journalistic record confirming this accusation. Older residents of Southington who remembered the Hallahan Funeral Home have denied these accusations, describing the business operators as respectable people. However, the Warrens maintain this claim as a central part of their theory about what was occurring in the house. According to their interpretation, acts of necrophilia committed in a place designed to honor the dead would have been an extreme desecration. Such desecration, in the theological framework the Warrens used, could have opened spiritual doors, inviting demonic entities to manifest in that space. Lorraine Warren, using her alleged psychic abilities, claimed that the house wasn't simply haunted by ghosts of deceased people. According to her assessment, the house was infested with demonic entities. Not human spirits, but demons in the Catholic theological sense of the term. This distinction was important to the Warrens. Their investigation methodology was deeply rooted in Catholic theology. They believed in the literal existence of demons as malevolent entities separate from human souls. And they believed these demons could manifest in the physical world under certain circumstances, particularly in places where extreme acts of evil or desecration had occurred. The Warren team didn't just document the family's reports. They themselves claimed to experience paranormal phenomena while at the house. According to the investigation records, multiple team members reported being physically attacked by invisible forces. Ed Warren reported being slapped, pushed, and tripped while investigating in the basement. Lorraine Warren claimed to feel intense demonic presences in multiple areas of the house. John Zaffis, the Warrens' nephew, reported a particularly terrifying experience. According to Zaffis' documented testimony, while sleeping in the house during one of the nighttime investigation sessions, he experienced sleep paralysis. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He felt an oppressive presence over him, pressing on his chest, preventing him from breathing normally. The experience was traumatic enough that Zaffis remembered and described it in detail years later. Sleep paralysis is a medically recognized phenomenon that can occur when a person is between sleep and waking states. The brain is partially awake, but the body remains in the state of muscular paralysis that normally occurs during REM sleep. It can be terrifying and often accompanied by hallucinations and sensations of chest pressure. However, for the Warrens and their team, Zaffis' experience was evidence of demonic attack. Other investigators accompanying the Warrens reported being pushed, feeling invisible hands grabbing them, and experiencing sensations of being watched by malevolent presences. These reports were documented in the Warren Investigation Archives. During this period of active investigation, the phenomena in the house seemed to intensify. Carmen reported that the paranormal activity didn't diminish with the presence of the investigators. If anything, it became more violent and more frequent. The smells of decomposing flesh became more intense and more persistent. The smell appeared in multiple rooms, not just in the basement. It was so strong that both the family and the investigators documented it independently. The visual apparitions Carmen had previously reported continued. The thin figure with long black hair and dark eyes was seen by multiple people, not just Carmen. Other investigation team members reported seeing human-shaped shadows moving through the house. It was during this period that one of the most serious and documented incidents of the entire case occurred: Philip's attack on his cousin Tammy. According to multiple documented sources, including medical reports that subsequently became public, Philip physically attacked Tammy violently. The exact details of the attack aren't completely clear in public records, but the severity was sufficient to require immediate medical intervention. Philip, the teenager who had been fighting cancer, who before the diagnosis had been described as sensitive and creative, had attacked a family member with violence that was completely out of character. And according to reports, Philip appeared to be in an altered state during the attack. He wasn't himself. His family described him as if he were possessed. As a result of this incident, Philip was transported by ambulance to a psychiatric institution. Records document that he spent 45 days in psychiatric evaluation and treatment. This is a verifiable and documented fact of the case. Philip Snedeker was institutionalized for a month and a half after attacking a family member. The doctors who evaluated Philip at the psychiatric institution diagnosed several psychological problems. Some reports mention he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, a severe mental disorder that can include psychosis, hallucinations, and drastic personality changes. This diagnosis, if accurate, could explain many of the behavioral changes Philip had been exhibiting. However, Carmen and the Warrens maintained that Philip's behavior wasn't the result of natural mental illness, but of demonic influence. According to their interpretation, Philip had been particularly vulnerable to demonic possession due to his condition weakened by cancer and because he slept at the epicenter of paranormal activity, the basement that had been an embalming room. The Warrens took extensive photographs of the house. Some of these photographs, they claim, captured visual anomalies, orbs of light, mist that shouldn't be there, shadows in places where there were no physical sources causing them. These photographs were included in subsequent presentations the Warrens made about the case. Skeptics, including investigators like Joe Nickel and Benjamin Radford, would subsequently analyze these photographs and argue that the anomalies could be explained by common technical problems in photography: dust on the lens, exposure problems, light reflections, etc. But for the Warrens and their believers, the photographs were visual evidence of paranormal activity. The Warren team also made audio recordings in the house. According to their reports, they captured electronic voices, what in the paranormal field is known as EVP or electronic voice phenomena. Allegedly, the recordings contained voices or sounds that hadn't been audible during recording but appeared on the tapes when played back. These recordings, like most EVP, are highly ambiguous. The captured sounds are often barely audible and require significant interpretation. Skeptics argue that EVP are generally the result of auditory pareidolia, the human brain interpreting random noise as meaningful patterns, specifically as language. But for paranormal investigators, EVP are evidence of communication with non-physical entities. The Warrens used thermometers to document what they called cold spots in the house. According to the paranormal theory they used, spiritual entities extract energy from the environment to manifest, which can cause sudden and localized temperature drops. They reported finding multiple areas in the basement and other parts of the house where the temperature was significantly lower than in surrounding areas with no apparent physical explanation. Based on their investigation, the Warrens reached a definitive conclusion. The house at number 208 Meriden Avenue wasn't simply haunted. It was, in their words, infested with demons. And the Snedeker family was under active spiritual siege that required immediate religious intervention. The Warrens, being devout Catholics, firmly believed in the power of the Catholic Church to combat demonic forces. They recommended that the house be blessed by a Catholic priest as a first step, potentially followed by a formal exorcism if the blessing wasn't sufficient. Carmen and Alan, desperate after nearly 2 years of terrifying phenomena and especially after Philip's attack on Tammy and his subsequent psychiatric hospitalization, accepted the Warrens' recommendation. They would contact the local Catholic Church and request help. The situation had escalated beyond what the family could handle on their own. It was no longer just a matter of strange phenomena they could try to ignore. Philip had attacked a family member. He had been institutionalized. The danger was real and immediate. The Warrens contacted Catholic priests from the local diocese. They explained the situation. They presented their documentation. They requested that the church intervene officially. The Catholic Church's response, according to documented records, was initially cautious. The church has strict protocols for cases of alleged demonic possession and paranormal activity. They don't send priests to perform exorcisms based solely on reports from paranormal investigators, no matter how famous they are. However, given the family's state and the severity of the reported situation, the church agreed to send priests to perform a house blessing. This isn't a formal exorcism, which requires special episcopal approval. A house blessing is a standard Catholic ritual that can be performed by any priest. According to documented records of the case, 2 Catholic priests were initially sent to the Snedeker house in 1988 to perform a blessing. The priests went through the house, prayed blessing prayers, and sprinkled holy water in each room. The blessing, according to reports from the family and the Warrens, had no lasting effect. The paranormal phenomena continued after the priests left. If anything, some witnesses reported that the activity temporarily intensified, as if the entities in the house were responding with anger to the religious intervention. During the celebration of a Catholic Mass in the house, a particularly dramatic incident occurred. According to documented testimony, Ed Warren suffered a mild heart attack during the ceremony. It wasn't a massive attack requiring prolonged hospitalization, but it was serious enough to cause alarm and require medical attention. Ed Warren, according to his own subsequent testimony, believed the heart attack hadn't been coincidence. He interpreted the incident as a direct attack from the demonic entities in the house, enraged by his presence and by the attempt at spiritual cleansing through the Catholic Mass. The doctors who treated Ed Warren would probably have attributed the heart attack to normal medical risk factors. Ed was 62 years old at that time, an age where heart problems aren't unusual, especially in someone who had lived an active and often stressful life investigating paranormal cases. But Ed maintained his interpretation that he had been spiritually attacked. The Snedeker family found themselves in a desperate situation. Philip was institutionalized. The phenomena in the house continued. Catholic blessings hadn't worked. And now even the most experienced paranormal investigator they knew had suffered a heart attack in their house. They needed something stronger. They needed a formal exorcism. And the Warrens were determined to get it for them. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic rituals documented in Connecticut's modern paranormal history. An exorcism that, according to witnesses, would involve not only prayers and holy water, but physical manifestations that would defy any rational explanation. The terror on Meriden Avenue was about to reach its climax. After the failure of the 2 initial blessings and Ed Warren's heart attack during the Catholic Mass in the house, the Warrens intensified their efforts to secure a formal exorcism of the property. It wouldn't be easy. The Catholic Church has extremely strict procedures for authorizing exorcisms, especially after controversies generated by previous cases like that of Anneliese Michel in Germany during the 70s. A formal exorcism of place, known in Latin as exorcismus locorum, requires episcopal approval. The diocese's bishop must review the evidence, consider alternative explanations, and be convinced that genuine demonic activity exists before authorizing the ritual. It's not a decision made lightly. The Warrens presented their complete documentation to ecclesiastical authorities. Photographs, audio recordings, detailed testimonies from the Snedeker family, their own observations as experienced investigators. Philip's medical history, including his psychiatric hospitalization after attacking Tammy. Everything was compiled and presented to the local diocese. The family's situation was genuinely desperate. Carmen and Alan had lived nearly 2 years in a state of constant terror. Their children had been traumatized by experiences they couldn't explain or control. Philip had been institutionalized. The family unit was on the verge of total collapse. Finally, according to documented records of the case, a third priest was authorized to perform a formal exorcism of the house. The ritual was scheduled for September 6, 1988. The exorcism, according to all documented testimonies, lasted approximately 3 hours. It was an extensive and exhaustive ritual involving prayers in Latin, specific biblical readings, sprinkling of holy water in each room, and the use of Catholic sacramental objects like crucifixes and relics. The priest, whose name hasn't been publicly revealed in most sources to protect his privacy, went through the entire house. He paid particular attention to the basement, which both the family and the Warrens had identified as the epicenter of paranormal activity. Each room was exorcised individually. Every corner of the property was blessed. The Snedeker family, along with Ed and Lorraine Warren and other investigation team members, were present during parts of the ritual. Not during all of it, as certain components of Catholic exorcism are reserved only for the officiating priest, but they witnessed significant portions of the ceremony. According to Lorraine Warren's testimony, documented in multiple subsequent interviews and in the book, In a Dark Place, something extraordinary occurred at the climactic moment of the exorcism. A large tree in the property's yard suddenly split in half and fell to the ground with a tremendous crash. This incident of the falling tree has become one of the most cited elements of the Snedeker case. According to Lorraine Warren, the weather at that moment was calm. There was no storm. There was no strong wind. There was no obvious meteorological reason for a mature and apparently healthy tree to spontaneously split. Lorraine interpreted this event as the physical manifestation of demonic entities being violently expelled from the house. In her theological framework, the power of the exorcism ritual had forced the demons to abandon the property, and their departure had caused a physical disturbance so intense that it had destroyed the tree. Skeptics would subsequently point out that trees fall for multiple natural reasons that aren't always immediately apparent. Internal disease, root damage, structural decomposition invisible from the outside. And certainly, the temporal coincidence could be exactly that, coincidence. But for the witnesses present that day, the tree falling at the exact moment of the exorcism's climax was dramatic confirmation that something supernatural was occurring. Other paranormal investigators present during the exorcism reported feeling changes in the house's atmosphere as the ritual progressed. The oppressive sensation they had been experiencing for weeks seemed to gradually lift. The air, which had felt heavy and charged, began to feel lighter. The temperature, which had fluctuated erratically, stabilized. When the exorcism finally concluded after 3 exhaustive hours, the priest declared that the house had been cleansed. The demonic entities, according to his professional assessment as an authorized exorcist, had been expelled. The family could now live in peace in their home. And according to all documented reports from the Snedeker family and the Warrens, the exorcism worked. The paranormal phenomena that had tormented the family for nearly 2 years ceased after September 6, 1988. The apparitions stopped manifesting. Objects stopped moving on their own. The inexplicable smells disappeared. The voices fell silent. Carmen reported that the difference was immediate and dramatic. The house, which for 2 years had felt hostile and threatening, suddenly felt normal. Just a house. Just wood and stone and cement. Without invisible presences. Without lurking malevolence. Philip, who had been released from the psychiatric institution by that time after completing his 45 days of evaluation and treatment, also showed improvement according to family reports. The extreme personality changes diminished. The episodes of amnesia or out-of-character behavior became less frequent and eventually ceased. The Snedeker family remained in the house on Meriden Avenue for some time after the exorcism. Exactly how long they remained there isn't completely clear in public records, but they eventually moved from Southington. The house had caused them too much trauma. Even if the paranormal phenomena had ceased, the memories remained. The fear remained. The Warrens documented the complete case in their official archives. They conducted extensive interviews with each family member. They compiled all their photographic and audio evidence. And eventually they decided to make the case public through a book. In 1992, 4 years after the exorcism, In a Dark Place, the story of a true haunting was published. The book was written by Ray Garton, a horror novel author, in collaboration with Ed and Lorraine Warren and with Alan Snedeker. Carmen Snedeker also contributed with her detailed testimony. The book detailed the entire family experience from their move into the house in 1986 to the exorcism in 1988. It included the Warren investigations, theories about necrophilia in the funeral home, demonic manifestations, and finally the resolution through Catholic exorcism. In a Dark Place became a moderate success in the paranormal nonfiction genre. The Snedeker case began to be known more widely in the paranormal enthusiast community, and eventually Hollywood would become interested in adapting the story for film. But the book's publication also brought something unexpected: significant controversy over the veracity of the entire story. Ray Garton, the writer hired to write the book, subsequently made public statements that fundamentally questioned the Snedeker case's authenticity. In later interviews, including a notable interview with the website Damned Connecticut, Garton claimed that the Snedekers couldn't keep their individual stories consistent. According to Garton, when he found significant discrepancies between testimonies from different family members and went to Ed Warren to express his concern, Warren allegedly told him, "They're crazy. All the people who come to us are crazy, that's why they come to us. Just use what you can and make up the rest. You write scary books, right? Well, make it up and make it scary. That's why we hired you." This alleged statement by Ed Warren, if accurate, would suggest the Warrens knew the Snedeker story had credibility problems but were willing to embellish or fabricate parts of it to create a saleable book. Garton eventually completed the book but remained deeply skeptical about the authenticity of the events he was narrating. Garton's accusations generated intense debate in the paranormal community. Warren defenders argued that Garton might be fabricating or exaggerating Warren's alleged instructions to generate publicity for himself. Skeptics pointed to Garton's statements as evidence that the entire Snedeker case had been invented or significantly dramatized. Another critical voice emerged from within the Snedeker family itself. Nancy Boucher, Alan Snedeker's sister, eventually spoke publicly about the case. Nancy had lived in the house with the Snedeker family for 3 months while looking for her own place to live. She was there during the period when paranormal phenomena were allegedly occurring. In an interview with Damned Connecticut documented publicly, Nancy Boucher claimed she never experienced anything paranormal during the 3 months she lived in the house. Nothing. No apparitions. No objects moving on their own. No strange smells. No inexplicable phenomena of any kind. Nancy also made strong statements about her brother and Carmen's motivations. She suggested the family had fabricated or significantly exaggerated the paranormal story for financial reasons. Philip's medical bills were enormous. The family was in severe economic difficulties. A successful book and potentially a film could provide the money they desperately needed. "I've never met Ray Garton and don't want to," Nancy said in her interview. "The shit he said about my brother and his family really pissed me off." This statement suggests Nancy was defending her brother and his family against Garton's accusations, but her own testimony of not experiencing anything paranormal during 3 months living in the allegedly haunted house contradicted the case's central claims. The house's owner, Daryl Kern, also spoke publicly after the book was published. According to the Hartford Courant article from 1992, Kern insisted he had informed the Snedekers about the house's history as a funeral home before they signed the lease contract. This directly contradicted Carmen's claim that they knew nothing about the house's past until after moving in. Kern also expressed skepticism about the paranormal claims. None of the previous or subsequent tenants had reported similar experiences, according to him. The house was simply a house. Southington neighbors who were interviewed by journalists after the case became public expressed mixed opinions. Some remembered that the Snedeker family seemed to be going through obvious difficulties, although they attributed this more to Philip's illness and economic problems than to paranormal activity. Other neighbors didn't remember anything particularly unusual about the family or the house during the period in question. In 2002, the Discovery Channel produced a documentary titled A Haunting in Connecticut as part of their A Haunting series. The documentary presented the Snedeker case with dramatized recreations and interviews with Carmen and the Warrens. This brought renewed attention to the case and presented it to a new generation of paranormal enthusiasts. The documentary was popular and helped cement the Snedeker case as one of the best known in American paranormal history. But it also generated more scrutiny and more questions about the reported event's authenticity. In 2009, Gold Circle Films produced a horror film loosely based on the Snedeker case titled The Haunting in Connecticut. The film, directed by Peter Cornwell and starring Virginia Madsen and Kyle Gallner, took significant liberties with the real story. Character names were changed. Plot elements were dramatized or invented completely for cinematic effects. The film was a moderate box office success, earning over $55 million worldwide against a production budget of $10 million. This brought massive attention to the Snedeker case, but also brought criticism from those who felt Hollywood had distorted and sensationalized a story that was already controversial. 2 weeks before the film's release, Susan Trotta Smith, who was the house's owner at that time, spoke with the Record Journal. Her statements were unequivocal. "We've lived in the house for 10 years. Our house is wonderful. This is all Hollywood foolishness. The stories are all ludicrous." Trotta Smith and her family had experienced absolutely nothing paranormal during their 10 years living at number 208 Meriden Avenue. For them, it was simply a normal house in a quiet Connecticut neighborhood. Nothing more. The controversy over the Snedeker case's authenticity continues to this day. Believers point to the Warren documentation, multiple witnesses, consistency of certain story elements over time, and the official exorcism authorized by the Catholic Church as evidence that something genuinely paranormal occurred in that house. Skeptics point to contradictions between testimonies, Ray Garton's statements about being instructed to invent parts of the story, Nancy Boucher's testimony of experiencing nothing during 3 months living there, and the fact that subsequent owners reported no paranormal activity. Prominent skeptical investigators like Joe Nickell and Benjamin Radford have examined the case in detail. Nickell, a skeptical paranormal investigator with decades of experience, concluded the Snedeker case was probably fabricated or significantly exaggerated. Radford reached similar conclusions, suggesting the family's financial motivations and the Warrens' interest in high-profile cases had resulted in a story that was more fiction than fact. However, Carmen Snedeker has consistently maintained that the events described in the book and in her public testimonies really occurred. In the rare interviews she has given in subsequent years, she insists her family experienced genuine paranormal terror in that house. She rejects accusations of fabrication or exaggeration. Philip Snedeker, the son whose cancer illness had been the catalyst for the family's move to Southington, survived his Hodgkin's lymphoma. The treatment worked. The cancer went into remission. Philip grew up, became an adult, and built a life for himself. He married and had 4 children. He worked as a truck driver. He loved hunting and music, according to his subsequent obituaries. He had managed to survive not only cancer but also the traumas of his adolescence, whether paranormal or psychological. Tragically, Philip's cancer returned in his adult life. On January 9, 2012, Philip Snedeker died in Tennessee at the age of 38. The Hodgkin's lymphoma he had fought so valiantly in his adolescence finally overcame him 2 decades later. His death added a note of profound sadness to the case. Regardless of whether the paranormal events in Southington were real or not, Philip had been a genuinely sick child who had suffered tremendously. He had survived additional years, had lived, had loved, had had family. But in the end, the disease that had dominated so much of his adolescence returned to claim him. Ed Warren died on August 23, 2006 at 79 years old. Lorraine Warren continued working in paranormal investigation until her death on April 18, 2019 at 92 years old. Both are buried at Stepney Cemetery in Monroe, Connecticut. The Warrens' legacy is deeply controversial. For their believers, they were brave investigators who helped terrorize families that no one else would take seriously. For skeptics, they were charlatans who fabricated or exaggerated paranormal cases for personal gain and fame. The house at number 208 Meriden Avenue in Southington, Connecticut, still exists. It's a private residential property. Subsequent owners have lived there without reporting paranormal experiences. It is, according to all external appearances, simply a house in a quiet New England neighborhood. But its history has made it part of American paranormal folklore. Occasional tourists still drive by to see it, despite protests from current residents who simply want to live in peace without being part of a paranormal legend. The Snedeker case remains as one of the most debated in modern paranormal history. Was it real or was it fabricated? Was it genuine experience or was it financial opportunism? Was it supernatural terror or was it mental illness exacerbated by extreme stress and then exploited? The truth probably will never be known with absolute certainty. The only ones who truly know what occurred in that house between 1986 and 1988 are the Snedeker family members themselves. And their testimonies, though consistent in certain aspects, have been questioned sufficiently that doubt remains. More than 3 decades have passed since the Snedeker family first moved to number 208 Meriden Avenue in Southington, Connecticut. Nearly 4 decades since the exorcism that allegedly ended the paranormal phenomena they reported. And in all that time, the Snedeker case hasn't lost its capacity to generate intense debate, profound skepticism, and continuing fascination. The case sits at a peculiar intersection of American paranormal culture. It's sufficiently well documented, with multiple testimonies, investigation by recognized figures like the Warrens, and an official Catholic Church exorcism, to be taken seriously by believers in the paranormal. But simultaneously it's plagued by enough contradictions, accusations of fabrication, and lack of verifiable physical evidence to be dismissed by skeptics as fiction or fraud. The truth about what really occurred in that house between 1986 and 1988 remains, fundamentally, inaccessible. There's no way to travel back in time and objectively observe the reported events. There's no indisputable physical evidence that can be scientifically analyzed. There are only human testimonies, all with their own perspectives, motivations, and inherent limitations. What we can do is examine what's documented in public records and evaluate the lasting legacy the case has left. The house on Meriden Avenue changed owners multiple times after the Snedekers moved. Each new owner has consistently reported that the house is perfectly normal. There are no paranormal phenomena, no apparitions, no objects moving on their own, no inexplicable smells. Just an ordinary residential house in a quiet Connecticut neighborhood. Susan Trotter-Smith, who owned the house when the film was released in 2009, was particularly vocal about this. In multiple interviews with local newspapers including the Record Journal and NBC Connecticut, she insisted her family had lived peacefully in the house for a decade without experiencing anything unusual whatsoever. "Our house is wonderful," she said emphatically. "This is all Hollywood foolishness. The stories are all ludicrous." Trotter-Smith expressed frustration that the film's release had brought curious tourists to the neighborhood, bothering current residents who had no connection to the alleged events from 20 years earlier. Southington police, according to Sergeant Lowell De Palma in statements to the Record Journal, had received complaints from Trotter-Smith and from neighbors concerned about people entering the property or loitering, searching for evidence of the paranormal that simply wasn't there. This pattern, where subsequent owners report no paranormal activity, is common in alleged haunted house cases and is frequently cited by skeptics as evidence against the original claim's authenticity. If a house is genuinely infested with demonic entities, skeptics argue, why would the phenomena cease completely and permanently after a specific family moves out? Defenders of the Snedeker case respond that the 1988 exorcism was effective. The entities were permanently expelled by the Catholic ritual. The house was spiritually cleansed and has remained clean since then. It's precisely because the exorcism worked that subsequent owners haven't experienced anything. But this explanation doesn't satisfy skeptics, who point out there's no way to independently verify if an exorcism was effective, except by the subsequent absence of phenomena, which creates a perfect circular argument. The debate over the case's authenticity centers on several critical points of controversy that have never been satisfactorily resolved. First is the question of testimonial inconsistencies. Ray Garton, the writer hired to write In a Dark Place, publicly claimed the Snedeker family members couldn't keep their stories consistent with each other. Different family members reported contradictory versions of the same events. Details changed between narrations. Garton characterized this as evidence the family was fabricating or significantly embellishing their experiences. Family defenders argue testimonial inconsistencies are normal when multiple people remember traumatic events that occurred years ago. Human memory is notoriously fallible and reconstructs events rather than remembering them as perfect recordings. Small inconsistencies don't necessarily indicate deliberate fabrication. Second is Ed Warren's alleged instruction to Ray Garton to make up the rest and make it scary. If Warren actually said this as Garton claims, then it fundamentally undermines the credibility of the entire Warren investigation of the case. It suggests Warren knew the story had problems but was willing to fabricate elements to create a saleable book. Warren defenders argue Garton might be exaggerating or misinterpreting conversations that occurred decades ago. They point out Garton had his own incentives to generate controversy, as notoriety helps sell his own books. And they note the Warrens had already died when Garton made his most serious accusations, so they couldn't defend themselves. Third is Nancy Boucher's testimony, Alan Snedeker's sister, who lived in the house for 3 months and experienced nothing paranormal. This is particularly problematic for the official narrative because Nancy wasn't an outside skeptic. She was family. She lived in the house during the period when phenomena were allegedly occurring, and she reports zero experience. Case defenders suggest paranormal entities might have chosen not to manifest for Nancy, or that she simply wasn't sensitive to phenomena others perceived. But for skeptics, Nancy's testimony is devastating to the case's credibility. Fourth is the question of financial motivation. The Snedeker family was in desperate economic circumstances. Philip's medical bills were enormous. A successful book, film rights, documentary appearances, all these things could provide much-needed money. Skeptics argue this created a powerful incentive to fabricate or exaggerate a paranormal story. Defenders argue this is cynical and there's no direct evidence the family fabricated the story for money. Carmen Snedeker has given very few public interviews over the years and doesn't appear to have actively sought the spotlight in ways that would suggest purely financial motivation. Fifth is the absence of convincing physical evidence. Despite weeks of investigation by the Warren team with multiple cameras and recorders, there are no indisputably paranormal photographs from the case. No audio recordings that can't be explained by normal phenomena. No physical evidence that can be scientifically analyzed and demonstrates supernatural activity. The photographs the Warrens presented showing alleged anomalies can all be explained by common photographic problems. Dust, exposure issues, lens flares. The recorded EVPs are ambiguous and require significant interpretation. The documented cold spots could have mundane explanations related to poor insulation or air currents. For believers, the absence of indisputable physical evidence isn't surprising. Paranormal phenomena, by their very nature, are elusive and difficult to capture with technical equipment. The paranormal doesn't follow the rules of the physical and can't be forced to manifest for cameras. For skeptics, the absence of physical evidence after such extensive investigation is exactly what they'd expect if there was nothing genuinely paranormal occurring at all. The Snedeker case has had significant cultural impact beyond the debate about its authenticity. It has inspired multiple media adaptations that have reached audiences of millions of people. The Discovery Channel documentary, A Haunting in Connecticut, from 2002 introduced the case to a massive television audience. The show's format, with dramatized recreations interspersed with interviews of real witnesses, has become standard for paranormal television. The 2009 theatrical film, The Haunting in Connecticut, though dramatized and significantly altered from the reported events, was a modest commercial success. It earned over $55 million globally and helped cement the Snedeker case in popular paranormal consciousness. The film even generated a loose sequel, The Haunting in Connecticut 2, Ghosts of Georgia, in 2013. The book, In a Dark Place, remains in circulation and continues to sell to new generations of readers interested in the paranormal. It has become a standard reference text for those studying haunted house cases, whether as believers or as skeptics analyzing the claims critically. The case also played a role in establishing Ed and Lorraine Warren as the preeminent figures in American paranormal investigation. Though they were already known for the Amityville case, their work on the Snedeker case helped solidify their reputation. This eventually led to the Conjuring film franchise that began in 2013, films that feature dramatized versions of the Warrens portrayed by Patrick Wilson and Vera Farmiga. The Warrens Occult Museum in Monroe, Connecticut, which contained artifacts from their investigations including some elements from the Snedeker case, became a tourist destination before closing to the public in 2019 due to zoning issues. In August 2025, comedian Matt Rife and YouTuber Elton Castee announced they had purchased the Warren House and Museum, becoming legal guardians of the artifacts until at least 2030. For the broader paranormal community, the Snedeker case represents both validation and a problem. It's validation because it involved extensive investigation by respected figures, official Catholic Church intervention, and multiple witnesses. It's a case that can be pointed to as evidence that paranormal phenomena are real and worthy of serious study. But simultaneously it's a problem because the controversies surrounding it provide abundant ammunition to skeptics. Every inconsistency, every accusation of fabrication, every contradictory testimony makes it harder to argue the case represents solid evidence of the supernatural. For serious paranormal investigators trying to establish their field as legitimate, cases like Snedeker are a double-edged sword. They generate interest and attention, but also generate criticism and skepticism that can damage the credibility of the entire field. The fundamental questions about the case remain unanswered and will probably remain unanswered indefinitely. Did the Snedeker family experience genuine paranormal phenomena in that house? Or was it a combination of extreme psychological stress due to Philip's illness, undiagnosed or inadequately treated mental health problems, and subsequent exaggeration or fabrication motivated by financial needs? Were Ed and Lorraine Warren honest investigators who genuinely believed in what they documented? Or were they opportunistic exploiters who fabricated or embellished cases for personal gain and fame? Did the Catholic exorcism of September 6, 1988 have a real effect in expelling demonic entities? Or was it simply a ritual that provided psychological closure to a traumatized family, allowing them to believe their torment had ended and therefore end their own participation in perpetuating the reported phenomena? Is it significant that subsequent owners reported no paranormal activity? Or is this simply what we'd expect if the original case was fabricated or exaggerated? These questions have no definitive answers. The truth, if there is a singular truth about the case, is buried under layers of fallible human testimony, complex and mixed motivations, ambiguous evidence that can be interpreted multiple ways, and the simple passage of time that makes direct verification impossible. What we can say with certainty is this. In 1986, a family with a seriously ill son moved into a house that had been a funeral home. That family reported terrifying experiences. Paranormal investigators documented these claims. The Catholic Church considered the situation serious enough to authorize a formal exorcism. A book was written. Documentaries were produced. A film was made. And decades later, people still fervently debate whether something genuinely supernatural occurred. Carmen Snedeker, now an elderly woman, rarely speaks publicly about her experiences. When she does, she firmly maintains that everything she and her family reported was real. She rejects accusations of fabrication. She insists they lived through a genuine paranormal hell that nearly destroyed their family. The house at number 208 Meriden Avenue remains. It's privately owned. Current residents live normal lives without supernatural interference. Paranormal tourists occasionally drive by, taking photographs from the street, searching for some visible evidence of the house's dark history. The Snedeker case has joined the pantheon of famous American paranormal cases. Amityville, the Bell Witch family, the Enfield poltergeist. Cases that are sufficiently well known to be cultural references. Cases that generate films and books and television shows. Cases that divide people into believers and skeptics with passionate convictions on both sides. And perhaps that's the only definitive conclusion we can reach. The Snedeker case, regardless of its factual authenticity, says something important about human nature. About our desire to believe in something beyond the material world. About our fear of the unknown. About our need for explanations, whether supernatural or psychological, for experiences that terrify us. The question of whether the Snedeker house was genuinely haunted will probably never be answered to everyone's satisfaction. But the story of that family, their reported terror, their search for help, and the controversial legacy they left, continues to fascinate, terrify, and inspire debate more than 3 decades later. In Southington, Connecticut, on a quiet New England street, stands a house that was a funeral home. A house where thousands of bodies were prepared for burial. A house that one family claims terrorized them to the point of needing an exorcism. A house that subsequent owners insist is perfectly normal. The truth of what occurred there remains, like so many paranormal mysteries, just beyond our reach. Suspended between belief and skepticism. Between testimony and evidence. Between fear and reason. And perhaps, in the final analysis, that's exactly how it should be. Because the best mysteries are those that are never completely solved. The most terrifying are those where we can never be absolutely certain what is real and what isn't. The house on Meriden Avenue keeps its secrets. And decades later, we still wonder what exactly the Snedeker family experienced in those rooms. What they saw in those shadows. What they heard in that darkness. We probably will never know for certain. And perhaps that uncertainty is the most terrifying part of all.